A Koi Pond production.
Civil war, and war in general, does not tend to stop at a front line. We can all have truth and reconciliation. That's not the end. How do you dig out all that hurt and all that oppression from the hearts of so many people? And so for me, writing has really become a way to explore the ways in which the courage with which people come back from tremendous violence and oppression.
So I wanted to begin by asking you about your first book, Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, which I think probably everyone in the room would agree is just a really, really extraordinary memoir, an amazing evocation of Africa and of your childhood there. An incredibly moving book. And I wanted to ask you about the process of writing it. First of all, why did you decide to write it?
Well, my mother considered that God had given her a pair of ovaries for one reason only, and that was to produce a biographer. So when she was pregnant with my sister, she read the fetus, the entire works of Shakespeare in the womb. And the upshot was my sister was born functionally illiterate. Wouldn't refuse to read or write. I mean, to the extent that she's even a bit sort of haphazard with the English language. So my mother fixed her then not inconsiderable literary ambitions on me, and I was 5 or so, and it was during the war in what was then Rhodesia. And instead of sending us to boarding school, because you couldn't, you kindergarten, they sent out packets for the parents to teach their children at home until you were old enough to be sent to those ruthless boarding schools. Anyway, they sent this correspondence packet out to Mum, and she would literally just get mathematics. Darling, you can always pay someone to count for you. But English, now this will be fun. Who are you going to write about? And then she would fix her not inconsiderable glare on me, and I would go, God, I guess you.
And you read her biography?
She was furious. Yeah, that was not what she was expecting. I think, you know, we all have a myth of ourselves, and my mother's myth of herself is that she's, I mean, that having been said, I think we have a myth of ourselves for a good reason, that living within a myth helps us to survive sometimes quite difficult situations, or helps us live with, you know, if we've got lousy politics, you can live with the myth that you know, you're fighting for freedom or something, when really you're part of an institution that supports apartheid, which is what my mother was doing. But the myth of herself, I think, was that, and in part this is a myth based on truth, like most myths are, that she's this incredibly resilient, very glamorous woman, terrifyingly fearless. I mean, I've never met anybody who so blindly will fight for what she believes is true. And so I think when Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight came out, and she read what she looked like from her child's perspective, it really undid her. And it took me it took me until 3 minutes ago to have compassion for how she must have felt reading that, because from my perspective, I thought I'd written a very compassionate portrait of a very complicated woman. But I think from her perspective, we all want the myth of ourselves to be generated. We don't want to see ourselves as we truly are. And I think sometimes, you know, I have, to my mother's credit, she's at last forgiven me for writing that book. And she even laughs out loud, you know, she'll sort of find it quite funny, and she'll say, you know, I'm completely crazy, and you should read this book and find out exactly how crazy I am.
I think that the first thing to be said was that actually I steered away from my own material for a long time, because for me it was an ordinary childhood, and actually growing up in war, growing up with insecurity, growing up with the spectre of poverty is the most common experience for most people globally. It's unusual, I think, to be middle class and secure, and that is a fallacy. It's a veneer over a sort of trembling structure that, as we've seen with the financial crisis, and as we've seen with climate change is just that, it's a veneer. I didn't know all of that, of course. You don't intellectualize that as a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, but I always did know I was going to write. I thought, though, and I think one rather grandly assumes this as a writer, that you're going to write great novels. And instead, I wrote 10 novels. They were all rejected by everyone, and my agent fired me. And I felt like I had nowhere left to go but the truth. And I actually wasn't expecting to get published. So I wrote a very candid book about my childhood, really, because by then I had moved to the States and I'd lived here for about 6 years, and I realized that my children were going to be Americans, and that they wouldn't know who I was, and that this piece of me doesn't get expressed in this culture. I think that a lot of immigrants have this sense of being bicultural, that you even sound different when you go home or when you're on the phone to people from home, and that when you are in the US, that you become this other thing. Not that that's inauthentic, it's just it wouldn't be effective for me to run around here as a Zambian, you know. And I wanted my children to know, yeah, this is where you came from. It wasn't all the romance that we read about in Out of Africa, and Gone with the Wind and the Flame Trees of Thika. There was war, there was violence, there was oppression. This was my life.
Racism.
I was undone by the realization of what my mother had gone through. She lost 3 of her 5 children. And a lot of my childhood, she's a very vivid person. She's very much larger than life. Talk about uncensored. But at least for that first memoir, the one thing that I couldn't bring myself to do was judge her. And I don't know if you remember, but in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, there were a lot of that memoir of look what a horrific life I had had. This sort of quite voyeuristic memoir was very popular. And then I read Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family, Mary Carr's The Liars Club, and James Galvin's supposed work of fiction, The Meadows. Those 3 books changed everything because they just told us very loving story about flawed people. And you can't put those books down because you know that you're holding the truth. You're not holding some embellishment. And I think that we are so afraid. This is a conversation I have so much, that there's almost this sort of accusation of, well, how could you have been so honest? Which makes me realize most of us must be lying our pants off 90% of the time, and that's become the most accepted part of our culture, that we somehow have made a contract with one another not to speak our truths. Why? And who is being hurt from that? Because I think in general, the powerful are the ones who end up with the voices in those circumstances. That began to rub and irritate me because it meant that the voices of millions and millions and millions of people were not being expressed. So you would end up with these books out of Africa that sort of talked about the romance and how heavenly it all was and the perfect equatorial light, and ignored, you know, the 44 million people in Kenya, or the 6 million people in Zimbabwe who were voiceless, and it ignored the pressure of the oppressors, that it's jolly hard work to be an oppressor. You can't afford to take your foot off the head of the people you're oppressing in case they rise up in outrage, which is what happened. And so although, of course, I love my parents, this wasn't necessarily, I wasn't holding them up or putting them under a magnifying glass. I was saying this, the only way this book makes sense or is of any value whatsoever is if I say that this is representative of a bigger whole. This is what oppression looks like. Oppression looks like love and family, and it is only perpetuated if we all agree with that, complicit, not in front of the children, you know, don't wash, you know, don't air your dirty laundry in public, and let's just be quiet about it. So I don't set out to make anyone uncomfortable, but the world's a very uncomfortable place, and if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And I think that the personal is political, and I think that we've really come away from that ability actually to have a safe conversation. One of the greatest gifts for me coming over here as an immigrant, I actually got sworn in as an American citizen in Kemmerer, Wyoming. And the man who did the swearing-in ceremony was the dentist in Kemmerer, actually. And we're all there weeping, and it was a bigger deal in a lot of ways than I anticipated. And he said, whatever it is that brought you here, whatever hunger it is that brought you to this country, whatever has driven you from the place that you love more than anything else, don't lose your hunger. Bring us your hunger and your anger. That's your gift to us. Don't lose it. And it was so moving and so compelling, and I've never forgotten his words, because for me, coming from Southern Africa with years of apartheid and then these oppressive regimes that followed the Rhodesian government with Robert Mugabe, for me that's freedom of speech. And the much more, the other unspoken piece of that is that it takes incredible courage to be able to listen openly to people who are expressing their opinions. And that isn't really what they teach you here. They tell you you have freedom of speech, and they don't say on the other side of it is that you need to listen. And so for me to spout off my polemic and my biggest story and my anxiety around the power that oil companies have, I think undue power. I know undue power, and the lack of regulations on the oil fields having to do with human safety. Wyoming has the highest death rate in the nation amongst workers, almost always the highest or in the top 5, because we contribute so many deaths on the rigs. But for me to say only that, I know already that in some ways I'm abusing my freedom of speech, and I'm making it harder for the reader to hear me, because that isn't a story that we can all relate to. But if I just tell a story of one man and his family who was killed on the rigs in 2006, then we become attached to him, and he is all of us. And what falls away is the things that divide us in this country, which is your political affiliation, and what your sense of whether or not oil companies have a right to drill with or without regulation. If all of that falls apart, and I'm just telling you the story of a man, that makes it quieter. It takes the information out of the discussion. We look up to and listen to power, and maybe that's always the case, but we assume we can treat people who aren't as educated and powerful as us badly, because we assume that they're voiceless, that their stories won't make it into the public sphere, and that we won't be held accountable for the ways in which we treated them. Who are you? What do you use to protect yourself from the world? And I think that's the question I ask myself all the time. What thing am I using to protect myself from hearing or seeing you? What prejudices am I bringing to the story that's disabled me from hearing or seeing you? And I think that we all have our self-protective labels and ways of protecting ourselves from feeling too much, because it's raw and painful and very rewarding to remove all the isms from yourself and just to feel the story. But the gift of that is that I think the sensory material comes to you, and then it's a matter of hoping that you find the words that convey that to the reader. Not every reader feels as if I succeed either. I think that that's the other thing that you've got to do as a writer, is realize you can only really write for an audience of one. The gift of growing up in Rhodesia was that between 25 and 100,000 white people felt entitled to the resources of an entire country in which 6 million people live. I don't think it's that different from now living in the US, where something like 5% of the world's population feels entitled to 25% of the world's resources. And I think the incredible amount of energy and violence that we expend getting those resources.
So the war can be internal as well.
I think the war always starts with something internal, and it's usually fear. Fear of not having enough, fear of other, really fear of ourselves, fear of our own appetite. No, you must understand, I wasn't some innocent. There are no innocents in war. The first casualty of war isn't truth, it's innocence. Then truth. Mm-hmm. There are no children in war. You are robbed of your childhood.
Yeah, it's a really powerful message. And it's an amazingly powerful book. It's a wonderful book. It's a tough book. It's a very, very tough.
Drink a lot if you're going to read it. That is my recommendation.
But beautifully written and beautifully felt. And it certainly put war in a different perspective for me. I mean, like you said, everyone's a victim.
Well, and I think that one of the things that doesn't get spoken about enough is what are the repercussions of war? What is the half-life of violence? What, for example, is the half-life of apartheid? You know, we can all have truth and reconciliation. That's not the end. How do you dig out all that propaganda and all that hurt and all that oppression from the hearts of so many people? How do you redress that imbalance? I mean, when we are violent, let's think about the half-life of that and the equal and opposite reaction to everything that we do.
Yeah, that's great. Did you, after writing that book, did you feel like you'd gotten rid of the demons to a certain extent?
No, I think I brought them back to life and they live with me now. And that's all right. It's not a bad thing to live with one's demons in the open.
Really?
Yeah, well, I'm all right with it. I mean,
How do you live with your demons? I mean, do they wake you up at night? Or?
Sure, and you'd have a jolly good conversation with them. And I mean, it's also right not to be completely content all the time. We shouldn't be content. You know, look at what we have done. Look at what we have done as both as a species. Look what we've done as a country. Look, what have I done as an individual? I should not be sleeping well at night. I think that's fair to say. And there are nights when I stay awake and I'm woken up by my own terror at 2 o'clock, and it's okay, I think, to be exhausted and to be, well, not terrified by your own self and by the things that one is responsible for. I can see that it would be really fun to live off a diet of Xanax and wine, but I would prefer to feel it all and to be very responsible for that. So I think that this idea that one should be contentedly sloping towards some sort of retirement is completely bogus. I think you should be terrified out of your wits all the time. Certainly pay attention more. My most recent assignment was to go for National Geographic to Zimbabwe. Thank you, National Geographic, for sending me home to my people. And what was amazing about that was Zimbabwe, of all people, very traumatized nation. They've been under subjugation of Robert Mugabe for 30 plus years. It's the 5th most dangerous place for journalists on the planet. I'm sure that changed. I mean, Syria may have bumped it to 6th. It's an incredibly oppressive place, and rape, for example, is routinely used as a weapon against communities to silence people. But very clever, actually. It's Peter Godwin termed this phrase smart genocide, which is you don't actually have to kill people if you can just rape an entire community of women, which has the double effect of both isolating them and terrorizing everyone into silence. What I met when I was there was women who refused to stay with that title of victim. They said, no, we are going to be activists. We're going to take our lives back in our hands and be with these women. Essentially, and again, what I love about writing for National Geographic, it's one of the few places anymore where one is allowed to go to a place and fully explore what is going on. They don't drop you in for 3 minutes and expect you to come up with a story. They drop you in for as long as you need to come up with the humanity of the place. And so to be with these women who not only recognized that they had been the victims of the violence, but they sat down with their perpetrators and said, both of us died that night. We both lost our humanity. You and me together. I am old enough to have suckled you, and you did this to me. Who are you? Who made you into this thing? And how do we go forward from here? Because unless we can go forward together, no one goes forward. I can't go forward alone. We have to move together. What a gift. What a gift. And so for me, writing has really become a way to explore the gift of being on the planet, the gift of our shared humanity, and the ways in which the courage with which people come back from tremendous violence and oppression. The terror, I think, for me, I mean, to be honest, the real difficulty is that I'm afraid of my own, how frightened I am. I'm most afraid of being too afraid to come back with a story. I'm afraid of being arrested. I'm afraid of being beaten. I'm afraid of being raped or tortured.
So you're living every day with that terror when you're researching the story.
Yeah, but I mean, and my basic understanding is, look, odds are really good. I've got a, U.S. passport. I get taken in, I'm probably going to get taken out. So my other real terror is, I'm very aware of the fact that everyone I'm talking to is in imminent danger, and that I have to be very, very responsible. that, you know, there's a big difference between being a story maker and a story taker. Story takers leave and they don't care what the consequences are. Story makers, I think you have to know that you're just really blessed with the opportunity to go in there and be with these amazing, in this amazing time, with these incredibly courageous people, and that your courage only has to match millions of theirs, and that your responsibility lies at home.
I wanted to ask you one last question. You've said so many moving, profound, amazing things tonight, but I'm just wondering, what's the kind of, if there were one truth that you would leave us with, what's the truth you would like to leave us with?
At the end of it all, he's still alive, so he's still going, but Dad took me down to the Zambezi River one day, and from his farm that he now is preparing to die on, he can see Zimbabwe, where my 3 siblings are buried, and where he fought an unjust war for 10 years. She will acknowledge. He'll say I was brainwashed. I spilled blood I shouldn't have spilled. But man will not raise a gun now. So he has been, 5 years ago, some robbers came. Dad said, I think they got the wrong cat, thought I had money. He was quite proud of the fact. And they broke his nose and knocked to 2,000. He hasn't had it fixed, but his pipe fixes sticks in there quite well. And everyone after that said, you got to get a gun. He says, no. And I know what he means. I know what he means. So we weren't even drunk, it was breakfast. And he said to me, the proper journey is taken alone. And if I told you that people die on that journey and maybe don't come back from it, that it will be lonely and that people will tell you you're crazy, you might not have the courage to go. So I won't tell you those things.